Welcome back to the show. My name is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk. This episode is titled The Blackstone Difference, and I didn't come up with that title as any sort of sales pitch, and that's not really what the episode was designed to be either. It just so happens that when you're really good at something, it can come off like you're bragging a little bit just when you try to explain it. But in truth, I wanted to unpack what we do a little bit, as well as why our approach and the end result is different than what you'll wind up with working with any other lab. So if you've listened to this podcast for, I think we released our first episode at the tail end of 2019. So it's been a while. And if you've been following along, even say just for a few episodes, then you'll note that we come up with a lot of situations that we come across on our day-to-day. Engines, transmissions, what they're going through, the results in any particular sample, what they speak to, what kind of problems can show up. And I think it's fair to say that when I'm unpacking a lot of situations, there are ifs, ands, or buts thrown in repeatedly pretty much every episode. And I think that at times it can come off like maybe we're dodging or being squirrely on purpose, trying to weasel out. I can understand where that could be the interpretation. So I think it's valuable to every now and again unpack a situation or two. I have one for today's episode in particular that just sheds light on the importance of variables and analysis, and using analysis to acknowledge variables and the impact they can have on certain results, so that way you know what to do when you have a result in hand, how you can make an action plan to proceed. So here's a situation that I come across almost on a daily basis. I'll be looking at a diesel engine, one that's almost new. And in the diesel engine owning community, or at least the folks that tend to send us samples, it's pretty common to use additives. A couple of these would be like Arch Oil or Revex. Now, these bear a couple of ingredients that also can be identifiers for contamination. I'm speaking about coolant in particular, so I'm going to try and not spend too much time in the classroom here with you, but I do need to unpack a couple of elements and what they can show. So coolant manifests in our tests as potassium and sodium, and primarily, I should say, because you can also get silicon from there too, but that's when you have a whole lot more potassium. So don't think about silicon as primary, it's far down the list. First, we're going to see a lot of potassium, a lot of sodium. However, you'll see potassium from an additive called Revex, as well as Arch Oil, like I mentioned previously. Now, if we have a new diesel engine, and we have a sample from an owner that likes using Revex, well, you can see a whole lot of potassium both from the additive, and you can see it from harmless flux that is produced early on in a diesel engine's life. So let's just say you're working with a lab that isn't Blackstone. They know that potassium is from coolant most likely, and they would see a high level and want to tell you that you have a leak, and fairly so. You would not want to see that element and disregard it. However, context matters. If it's a new engine, you can get potassium from harmless flux. You can also get it if you are an owner that likes using Revex or Arch Oil. So all of a sudden you can see the importance of context and variables and the role they play in a given context. So if I'm dealing with an owner, say they have a diesel engine that has a recall out. Maybe it has a problem with an EGR cooler, and they want to know if they have a coolant leak. Here's where the ifs, ands, or buts can come into play. And believe you me, this is not us trying to dodge answering the question or trying to weasel out of giving a definitive answer. No, instead, what we're doing is not just being a lab that sees a high level of an element and decides not to answer a question. What we will do instead is we'll take into account, say, if applicable, you're using an additive, or if it's new and there could be flux from the intercooler EGR that is impacting the result. Well, all of a sudden, you need an analysis to support a conclusion. So, the Blackstone difference is truly in the form of the role of an analyst and taking into account the various factors in the maintenance plan. Are you using additives? Is this a new engine on its first, second, even in the third oil change, you can see flux, and we also want to pay attention to additives. So, if you are not taking variables into account, I think it would be really easy to see high levels of certain elements, metals, additive elements, or markers for contamination, take them and run. And then all of a sudden, you end up making a lot of hard and fast calls, which would lead an owner down the wrong path. So, when you're dealing with elements that have more than one source, like potassium, like sodium, like silicon, it can be a frustrating process, right? Because, if it's a gasoline engine oil, maybe it uses sodium, and you're also trying to check for coolant, or it's diesel engine. We've talked about those sources of potassium and even metals. You want to be cautious when you're looking at a certain wear level and assigning a whole lot of gravity to the conclusion, making a declaration that an engine is in trouble just because you see a certain amount of metal. Ergo, I can see some owners looking at a situation and being like, well, why would I want to get analyzed at all? Because there's these different, outcomes for everything. Well, when you are a seasoned analyst and you know what to look for, you know what a typical wear profile is, the balance of metals, you understand certain situations where possible explanations are not applicable, then all of a sudden it gets a whole lot easier. So that's why you go to an analyst with Blackstone to unpack all these certain factors and tell you what matters and what doesn't. Because all of a sudden, if you're making these decisions on your own, you can end up taking into account a lot of variables that aren't applicable. Like for example, just today, I went to the gym and I went for a run. Veteran listeners of this show probably knew I was going to talk about either running or cooking at some point. Safe bet. So if you're playing Slick Talk Bingo, you can check off a running analogy. So earlier today, I was going for a run and it's 4 miles, and I happened to, I'm pretty sure, go the fastest I've ever gone. I was going at like a 5.5 minute mile pace for like a few minutes. And I could say take a variable that has no bearing on that result. Like earlier for breakfast, I had made biscuits and gravy. And I could say, well, the reason I ran the fastest pace was clearly because of the biscuits and gravy. And from now on, I'm going to eat that every single day I work out, and I'm guaranteed to have good results. No, probably happened is I ran that quickly because I have accumulated a lot of mileage and I have the cardio, I have the aerobic base, and I know what I can ask my body and when I can max it out, etc. I know what variables to assign to a certain outcome. Just like when you're owning an engine and you're a little out of your element with regards to what certain results mean, that's why the role of an analyst and understanding what additives matter. Is engine young enough for wear to be a factor? Is there an alternative explanation for high levels that don't amount to a problem? That's the difference between a lab that is not going to take into account context, take into account maintenance habits, other explanations for a high level, a less than ideal result. That is a big, big difference. And also, if you're left with numbers that aren't necessarily given any sort of conclusion, some labs are only going to identify high levels, but maybe they won't catch on to other things. Not every lab is even going to test for every element that we look for in a spectral analysis. So understanding different explanations for high levels or even levels that aren't necessarily, they don't jump off the page, but we can see there's something abnormal going on. Elements that don't look like additive or metals that are in a certain proportion to each other that just isn't typical for the engine type, understanding the big picture and also acknowledging, the ifs, ands, or buts. It can be frustrating when you have qualifiers if you're just trying to get, a positive or a negative result. Understandably so. Sometimes you just need that. But even in those situations, it's not like they don't occur. A few reports today I wrote where the owners just asked, do I have a coolant leak? And I was able to effectively rule that out. For every situation, though, where there's sort of a narrow path to the conclusion, there can be others where there's twists and turns. And just taking the time to understand what could be causing a less than ideal result. Is the condensation that's underneath the oil cap that's bothering you because it looks like milky and it could, you're worried that is coolant. Understanding what could cause that. Is it actually coolant contamination or is it just moisture from the atmosphere accumulating? Understanding what can cause symptoms to manifest both on your end and on the lab side. It's a whole lot to approach, and I think that can be overwhelming. And sometimes, if you are the owner, you just want to escape the whole process with a yes, no. But I also think it's important to understand that we, as customer service providers, would love nothing more than to throw out the definitive answer when we can. We would love to give it. So if there is a situation where you're looking for a quick answer, something that could, close the book for you, and we don't give it, either in an email or in the report. If there is an absence of a quick answer to the question, we're not hiding it. Personally, my approach when I'm writing a report, if the customer has a question and I can knock it out right away, I will. But you'll never have an instance where we didn't give the answer because we weren't at liberty to, or maybe we didn't want to tell you the less than ideal news, or maybe we just wanted to keep your business, so we want you to sample. That's not going to happen. If I can address your maintenance concern, and that happens to be the one only sample we see from you, then okay. As long as we are able to help keep your engine, your transmission going, mission accomplished. So we'll never hide the answer. And if we have these qualifiers to certain results, it's because of real world explanations that come into play that we need to acknowledge. And I'm sure for a lot of you, I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit here, because understanding variables and explanations for certain outcomes and how there can be, different routes there, it's not unique to our line of work. Even just to switch gears to, if you go through film, if you're watching film for especially like football, and, if you're like a casual fan, nothing bothers me more than people who look at stats and never assign context to them. You look at a certain amount of interceptions thrown in a game and you just make direct conclusions based on that. On quarterback play, I'm more the person who pays attention to the film and sees that, what we had here was a tipped pass, or what we had was, a missed route, or someone fell down on their route, or blah, blah, blah. There's so much that goes into every certain play on the field, or if you are in the culinary world and you know that one ingredient can serve a lot of different purposes, and you can't just, look at one ingredient and assign it to only one dish. You can look at your spice cupboard and know all that you can accomplish with certain ingredients, and know that they aren't all limited to one particular style of cooking. Like, it's not a foreign idea, I understand. But I also understand that sometimes people might get a little vexed, I think, by the approach of, well, or if, or are you, the questions that we pose that can sort of stand in the way, I think, for some folks' satisfaction with the analysis process. I understand that. So really, this episode is meant to unpack is the difference between simply looking at a result and making a direct conclusion in the absence of context and other factors that need to be acknowledged. We're not looking at certain results and going, well, let's go down the line of explanations and, kind of ignoring the elephant in the room. It's not that. But what it is taking into account factors that could directly influence, if we were to look at a result and immediately tell an owner to, proceed with expensive repairs or that there's no other explanation for it, that's what we want to avoid. And that's truly taking into account the big picture. That's the Blackstone difference. And not only is it, giving you all the information, but giving it to you in a way that's easy to understand, a way that is not in a different language. So that's my sermon for the day for you. Sometimes it's going to be a little bit more classroom, which makes sense. We are, after all, dealing with a whole lot of science, and I probably reached my cap on uses of the word variable in one episode. But thank you so much for sticking with us for 58 episodes. We have more content on the way, specifically with guests. We've had some folks over social media solving problems with oil analysis, and we're going to unpack their results, how they're able to use analysis to keep their cars on the road. So I'm excited to unpack that. But that has been my talk for the day on the Blackstone difference. If you like what you hear, don't forget to rate, review, subscribe, give us a follow on our Instagram, Facebook, the channels. This is Blackstone Joe signing off.